There is Hamas, which does have its own fuel and there's their own weapons that they have, prepared for this situation. So they are not necessarily running out of supplies, but are also preventing them from reaching the hands of ordinary Gazans. So the Biden administration wants temporary pauses for this humanitarian aid, which would come in through Egypt to get there and to be utilized by the civilian population, which are feeling the impacts of the war so far.
Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle. I'm joined today by defense reporter Mike Brest. And Mike, Israel is doing its incursion into Gaza to weed out Hamas. The Biden administration says it's against a ceasefire, but wants various humanitarian pauses. What is it exactly that the Biden administration is trying to accomplish?
So the Biden administration, since Israel was attacked on October 7th, has very publicly and very outwardly continued to support Israel and Israel's right of self-defense. Right. And so what that means is the United States has supported Israel's military operations into Gaza to prevent a future attack and to limit Hamas's capabilities. That's the intent of the war.
Right.
That being said, Israel, for the first 3 weeks, had not yet physically entered Gaza and were conducting their military operations via airstrike or dropping bombs onto Gaza. And so these were, while Israel tries to avoid civilian casualties, given specific circumstances on the ground, it makes it almost impossible. So we've seen a very high death toll in Gaza. Now there's some dispute on the specific number, but by most accounts, it's over 8,000 so far. And now that doesn't differentiate between terrorist or civilian, but in general, that's a very significant number, especially compared to recent flare-ups between Hamas and Israel. That being said, we're seeing a humanitarian situation developing in Gaza because the Israeli airstrikes have crippled Gaza infrastructure. There is a lack of food. There's a lack of clean water. We're seeing hospitals run out of fuel and be overwhelmed with the number of patients they have to treat. Now there is Hamas, which does have its own fuel and there's their own weapons that they have, prepared for this situation. So they are not necessarily running out of supplies, but are also preventing them from reaching the hands of ordinary Gazans. So the Biden administration wants temporary pauses for this humanitarian aid, which would come in through Egypt to get there and to be utilized by the civilian population, which are feeling the impacts of the war so far.
So there's also this element of there being hostages in Gaza, including some Americans. And so how does that play into efforts by the U.S. and some others to get them out? So
the U.S. Has put troops in the region, and President Biden even sent over a senior general who is familiar with urban warfare to help them try and get these hostages back, as you mentioned. On October 7th, when this unprecedented terrorist attack occurred, one aspect of it was that they took more than 200 people back to Gaza and are holding them as hostage. There is a number of Americans that are included, though it's not quite clear how many. The hostages, 5 of them have been freed so far, 4 were released, and the IDF was able to recapture one of their own in a military operation. But that leaves probably over 200 left, and it's not exactly clear where they are, if they're all together, and their well-being, though the 4 that have been released did talk about having been cared for pretty well, albeit in the tunnel structures that are underneath Gaza, which is what Israel is targeting now. So there is some concern that Israel's ongoing operations could in fact harm the hostages.
Now, as we film this, Senator Tommy Tuberville, the Alabama Republican, his holds on military promotions and confirmations are still in effect, but there's been a bit of a breakthrough in the fight against them. Talk a little bit about why we're hearing some Republicans really begin to speak out about this.
So there are a number of reasons, and part of it is related to Israel. We're seeing the U.S. not quite get on a war footing, but they're preparing for a possible eruption of tension in the Middle East that we're already seeing the early signs of. And so given that everything going on in the Middle East, given the war in Ukraine, combined with this ongoing hold due to Senator Tuberville's opposition to a DoD policy that's not related to war fighting, we've seen Republican senators, particularly ones that are more focused on defense and national security, come out against Tuberville and say it's time to at least confirm the senior level defense officials that are waiting to fill their positions because it's affecting readiness or it's affecting how the military is preparing to be ready in the event something happens. And so earlier this week, the Senate actually confirmed 3 nominees, senior nominees. So as of this video, the Joint Chief of Staff is now completely full. There are no vacancies, and it's the first time that can be said for a couple months now. And so while this passing or their confirmations, reduces the burden a little bit, there's still more than 300 nominations that are outstanding due to Tuberville's hold. And even despite the criticism he's faced from his own party, he has not shown an inclination that his hold is over.
Tuberville's hold doesn't necessarily prevent individuals from being confirmed, but the norm is to confirm them in batches, and that's really what he's holding up.
Exactly. So when the Senate, generally speaking, handles these types of nominations or confirmations, they'll do it by unanimous consent and in batches, so that way they can get through them more quickly. Tuberville is preventing them from doing it through unanimous consent, which means that the alternative would be to vote on them one at a time, individually, and that's not really a reasonable path forward because
it's
of
a
how
time-consuming
exactly.
path, right.
We've seen Democrat senators, specifically, those who are pushing for Tuberville to stop his hold, from talking about that, if they voted individually on every single nominee they have, it would take weeks. And that's because of how long this process is, which is why they generally don't do it this way, but Tuberville's forcing them to.
Thank you, Mike. You can read Mike and the rest of our national security team's coverage at washingtonexaminer.com.